The year was 1778, and the American colonies were deep in the throes of the Revolutionary War. Towns and villages across the countryside were caught between hope for independence and fear of the British forces that seemed unstoppable. Amid this chaos was the small village of Greenfield, nestled in the rolling hills of New York. Greenfield was not unlike many other towns at the time, a quiet place where people eked out a simple life. But the war had changed everything. In Greenfield, a group of children had grown up together, sharing adventures and dreams of a future unshackled from British rule. They were known affectionately as the Cannon Kids because of their love of playing near an old, rusting cannon that sat abandoned on a hill overlooking the town. The cannon, a relic from a long-forgotten conflict, had become their fortress, their castle, and their shared secret hideout. The group consisted of Tommy, the eldest at 14, and the natural leader, his younger sister, Sarah, who was quick-witted and brave, James, the blacksmith's son, whose strength belied his age, and Emma, the bookish daughter of the town's schoolteacher, whose imagination always seemed to find a way out of trouble. Life in Greenfield had grown tense as the war crept closer. Soldiers from both sides occasionally passed through, leaving the villagers wary and afraid. The adults spoke in hushed tones about battles lost and won, about British patrols capturing rebels, and about the Continental Army's desperate need for supplies and support. But for the Cannon Kids, the war was a distant thunder, a looming shadow that hadn't yet touched their world directly. That changed one crisp autumn afternoon. The group had gathered at the old cannon, their secret meeting place, to trade stories and share scraps of bread and apples. As they laughed and played, they spotted something unusual on the road leading into town. A wagon, moving slowly and deliberately, was being escorted by a small group of red-coated British soldiers. The kids froze, their laughter dying as they watched the soldiers march. The wagon was heavily loaded, its contents hidden under a thick canvas tarp. The Cannon Kids exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued. What was the British Army transporting through their quiet village? Without speaking, Tommy gestured for them to follow. They crept along the hillside, staying hidden in the trees as they trailed the wagon. When it reached the center of the village, the soldiers halted and began shouting orders. Villagers were rounded up and made to stand in the square as the soldiers pulled the tarp from the wagon. Beneath it were crates and barrels marked with the king's seal. "Powder and shot," whispered James, his eyes wide. "They're resupplying their troops." Tommy nodded grimly. The British were using Greenfield as a waypoint to ferry supplies to their advancing army. It wasn't just powder and shot. It was weapons, food, and medicine, all vital to their war effort. And it was happening in their village. The Cannon Kids knew they had to act. That night, as the village was blanketed in darkness, they gathered at the old cannon to plan. "We can't let them keep those supplies," Tommy said, his voice steady but urgent. "If they get to the British Army, it'll mean more of our soldiers killed, more of our towns burned." "But what can we do?" asked Sarah. "We're just kids." Emma's eyes lit up as an idea formed. "We're kids," she said, "but we have something they don't. We know this village and these hills better than anyone. We can outsmart them." Their plan took shape quickly. The supplies were guarded in the village square, but the Cannon Kids knew the British soldiers wouldn't expect an attack from children. They decided to use their knowledge of the terrain to create distractions and confusion, drawing the soldiers away from the supplies. Then, they would destroy the ammunition and food, ensuring it couldn't reach the British Army. The next night, they put their plan into action. Sarah and Emma crept into the village, using the shadows to stay hidden. They placed small bundles of dried leaves and branches at key points, setting tiny fires that sent up plumes of smoke. The British guards, thinking the village was under attack, rushed to investigate. Meanwhile, Tommy and James used the chaos to slip into the square. They worked quickly, prying open crates of powder and pouring it into the dirt, slashing bags of flour, and spilling barrels of water. Just as they finished, one of the soldiers spotted them. "Intruders!" he shouted, raising his musket. Tommy grabbed James, and they sprinted toward the edge of the square. Behind them, the soldier fired, the shot missing by inches. They darted into the narrow alleys of the village, using every shortcut and hiding spot they'd memorized as children. Sarah and Emma joined them at the edge of town, breathless but exhilarated. The British soldiers were in disarray, their supplies ruined and their plans thwarted. The cannon kids regrouped at the old cannon, laughing and hugging as the adrenaline coursed through them. They had done something extraordinary, something no one would believe if they told them. The next morning, the British soldiers left Greenfield, their wagon empty and their spirits low. The villagers, though unsure of what had happened, felt a renewed sense of hope. They whispered about unseen heroes, rebels who had struck a blow against the king's forces. The cannon kids never told anyone what they had done. They returned to their normal lives, keeping their secret as a shared bond. But the old cannon on the hill became more than a hideout. It became a symbol of what they had accomplished and what they could achieve together. As the war raged on, the cannon kids continued to find ways to help the cause of independence. They became couriers, messengers, and spies, using their youth and innocence as their greatest disguise. Their courage and ingenuity grew, and their legend spread quietly among the villagers, who watched them grow into young adults. Years later, when the war was over and the colonies had won their independence, the story of Greenfield's mysterious heroes became a cherished local tale. And the cannon kids, now grown, would occasionally gather at the old cannon, remembering the night they changed the course of history and became true heroes of the battlefield. The cannon kids continued their secret missions as the Revolutionary War intensified. Their small acts of defiance turned into significant contributions to the local Patriot cause. Greenfield, which had once been a quiet village, became a hotspot for British patrols due to its strategic location. The British suspected rebel activity, but could never trace it to the group of children who operated under the radar, their daring escapades growing bolder with each passing month. One frosty morning, a rider arrived in Greenfield bearing grim news. The Continental Army, struggling to hold its position in the harsh winter, was desperate for supplies and reinforcements. The British had fortified a nearby garrison, stockpiling provisions and ammunition to keep their troops well fed and equipped. The rider, a weary man with a patched coat and a tired horse, sought refuge in the village. Overhearing his conversation with the local elders, the cannon kids quickly realized the significance of the garrison and what it meant for the war effort. As the rider spoke of the army's plight, Tommy's mind churned with ideas. "If we could get to those supplies," he said to the group later that day, "we could tip the balance in favor of the army. They need food, weapons, and hope. We can give them that." James looked doubtful. "A garrison isn't a wagon in the village square. It'll be crawling with soldiers. It's too dangerous." Sarah, as always, was the voice of bravery. "It's dangerous, but we've done dangerous things before. Besides, we're not alone. The villagers trust us, even if they don't know what we've done," Emma added thoughtfully. "And we can use the element of surprise. No one would suspect kids of infiltrating a garrison. They won't even see us coming." The cannon kids spent the next week planning their most daring mission yet. They gathered intelligence by blending into the village, listening to passing soldiers, and even sneaking close to the garrison to observe its defenses. Tommy and Sarah learned the guard rotations by watching from the cover of the forest, while James crafted tools to disable locks and sabotage equipment. Emma pored over old maps of the area, identifying an overgrown trail that led to the rear of the garrison, a blind spot in the British defenses. On a moonless night, the group set out, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The forest was eerily quiet, the crunch of frost underfoot the only sound as they moved silently toward their target. Each carried a pack filled with tools, provisions, and a few improvised weapons. They knew the risks, but their resolve was stronger than their fear. Reaching the garrison's rear entrance, they found a section of the palisade that was partially rotted. James, with his blacksmith's strength, pried the boards loose, creating an opening just large enough for them to slip through. Inside, the garrison was quiet but alive with the occasional sound of soldiers talking and the clink of weapons being cleaned. The kids moved like shadows, sticking to the darkest corners as they approached the stockpile. Their first objective was the ammunition stores. Emma had devised a plan to disable the British cannons by tampering with their powder. James carefully opened barrels of gunpowder, adding handfuls of sand and water to ruin the contents. Meanwhile, Tommy and Sarah worked to dismantle the firing mechanisms on the muskets stored nearby, ensuring they wouldn't function when needed. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. A guard was making his rounds, his lantern casting flickering light ahead of him. The group froze, holding their breath as the light grew closer. Sarah, thinking quickly, grabbed a small stone from her pocket and tossed it down an adjacent hallway. The clatter drew the guard's attention, and he muttered under his breath as he went to investigate. The distraction bought them enough time to finish sabotaging the weapons and move to the food supplies. The group worked swiftly, puncturing barrels of flour and spilling sacks of grain. Emma, ever resourceful, left behind a trail of crumbs leading to the stables, hoping to attract rats that would further decimate the supplies. As they were about to leave, they heard a commotion near the main gate. Soldiers were shouting, and the sound of boots on cobblestone filled the air. The kids' sabotage had been discovered sooner than expected. Tommy gestured for the group to follow him, leading them back to the hole in the palisade. But as they neared the exit, a soldier spotted them and shouted in alarm. Panic surged through the group as they scrambled to escape. James stayed behind for a moment, using his strength to collapse a stack of barrels into the path of the pursuing soldiers. "Go!" he shouted, giving the others a chance to slip through the hole. They ran through the forest, branches whipping at their faces as they raced toward safety. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but they didn't stop until they reached the outskirts of Greenfield. The next morning, news of the sabotage spread like wildfire. The British garrison was in disarray, its supplies ruined and its weapons rendered useless. The Continental Army, hearing of the success, moved swiftly to capitalize on the opportunity, driving the British forces back and securing a much-needed victory. The Cannon kids, exhausted but exhilarated, watched from the safety of their village as the tide of the war began to shift. They had done the impossible, striking a blow against the British war machine and proving that even the smallest acts of resistance could have monumental consequences. Their exploits didn't end there. Over the next year, they became a vital part of the local resistance, using their ingenuity and courage to outwit the British at every turn. They guided soldiers through the forest, delivered messages across enemy lines, and sabotaged supply lines with a precision that baffled their foes. By the time the war ended, the Cannon kids had become legends in Greenfield, though their identities as the village's secret heroes remained a closely guarded secret. Decades later, when the group was grown and the Revolutionary War was but a memory, they reunited at the old cannon on the hill. The rusting metal and overgrown grass were a stark contrast to the vibrant memories of their youth, but the bond they shared was as strong as ever. Tommy, now a father and farmer, placed a hand on the cannon and smiled. "We changed the world from this hill," he said. Sarah, ever bold, laughed. "And we never let them know it was us." James, His hands, still calloused from years of smithing, nodded. "We were just kids, but we were the right kids at the right time." Emma, who had become a teacher and storyteller, looked at the horizon. "Maybe one day, people will tell our story. Not to celebrate us, but to show that anyone, no matter how small or young, can make a difference." As the sun set over Greenfield, the Cannon kids stood together, heroes of a battlefield long past but never forgotten. Their story, though untold in the history books, lived on in the hearts of those who knew them, a testament to the power of courage, friendship, and the unyielding spirit of freedom.